Hello and welcome to Runkle of the Bailey. My name is Ian Runkle. I'm a Canadian criminal defense and firearms lawyer. Today I want to talk about a notice that the RCMP has been sending out to firearms license holders. I think it's just going out to people who are allowed restricted or prohibited firearms, but I'm not entirely sure about that. I've got about 30 copies of this in my email now, so please don't send me any more. But I do appreciate the people who sent them to me, especially because it was good to know that everybody's getting the same notice. So let's have a look at this and talk about what it's saying and which parts are accurate and which parts are not. So, Royal Canadian Mounted Police. A change has recently come into force to the Firearms Act as part of Bill C-71, an act to amend certain acts and regulations in relation to firearms. The change has resulted in the removal of the following conditions related to the transport of restricted or prohibited firearms from your license. So these are things that you can no longer do that previously you could. So first, transport of restricted firearms and/or prohibited firearms to a port of exit in order to take them outside Canada and from a port of entry. So that's gone. Next is transport of those same guns to and from a gun show. Also gone. Next is transport of those same things to and from a business that holds a license authorizing it to repair or appraise prohibited or restricted firearms. Now, in my view, this is the worst of the things that they took out because sometimes the RCMP firearms program is closed. And so you're trying to call, but you might need to take it to a gunsmith right now. You might have an unsafe issue where you can't, for instance, extract a cartridge. And so this whole thing of, hey, you're going to have, if this happens Friday night at 8 p.m., the notion that you're going to have to figure out what you're going to do until Monday morning is maybe not the greatest idea. Maybe it's better if you go and get help with that right away. So this, I think, is actually a demonstrable reduction in public safety. But hey, it was a Liberal campaign promise, so there we go. And the next is transport of those firearms to and from any place a peace officer, firearms officer, or chief firearms officer is located for verification, registration, or disposal in accordance with the Firearms Act and Part 3 of the Criminal Code. Hey, conservatives, when you want to talk about this, you should talk about how the Liberals have actually made it substantially more difficult to get rid of guns, because now there's actually a lot more paperwork involved with getting rid of a gun. So, good work. Anyway, it continues on. If you wish to transport your restricted or prohibited firearm for one of the above purposes, you must apply for an authorization to transport to your chief firearms officer. To contact your chief firearms officer, please call, and they give the number. All affected license holders will be mailed a formal notification of the changes to the authorization to transport, including your current updated license conditions. So there are some things here that are not quite correct, and I think it's worth talking about what they got wrong, because this is a complicated area, and I think it's important that people understand this because firearms are an incredibly regulated area, and stepping outside those regulations, even by accident because you didn't understand the law, is extremely dangerous. So I want to make sure people know things better than the RCMP is communicating. So the first thing is there hasn't been a change to your authorization to transport because the law doesn't actually provide for any sort of amendment formula for an authorization to transport. They don't get changed. What they get is revoked. And that is exactly what the law provides for here. So, revocation of authorization to transport. All of the following authorizations to transport a prohibited or restricted firearm are revoked. So, authorizations issued under any of paragraphs 19, 2.1b to e, as those paragraphs read immediately before the commencement day, and another paragraph that basically is the same thing, but attempting to make sure they don't miss anything. So, the issue that comes up is that most people don't have separate authorizations to transport for each of the purposes. Like you don't have an authorization to transport for ranges, and then a separate one for gun shows, and then a separate one for, gunsmiths. What people had was just one authorization to transport that said all of those places. So because of that, all of those authorizations to transport have been revoked. They're gone, they're done. And when I called the chief firearms office, like the Office of the Canadian Firearms Program, they confirmed that this is exactly their view and exactly what's happened. So all of those have been revoked. Now, what the Canadian Firearms Program says they're doing is now issuing new authorizations to transport to everyone. Of course, how do you know you actually got issued one of those? You pretty much have to call in and confirm. So they have made themselves a whole bunch of work, because I personally would not transport a firearm for any purpose without confirming that I've got an ATT at this point. Making that assumption is a bad idea. Especially, I mean, it's not entirely clear that the Firearms Act allows the Canadian Firearms Program to just issue you an authorization to transport without you applying for it. That said, it doesn't say that you can't, and I can't see anybody complaining that they've done this. I mean, hey, you guys issued me an authorization to transport that I didn't ask for. That is only a benefit to me, so I'm upset. Maybe not. But people have said, oh, well, I have one automatically. And this is kind of a dangerous view, because there is a provision for automatic authorizations to transport, but it doesn't work the way that you might be thinking. It doesn't work such that you just automatically have it so long as you have a license. Let's have a look at how this works. And this is from Bill C-71, because it's actually changing the automatic authorization to transport rules. That said, it still worked in the fashion I'm talking about the same way in the old Firearms Act. So, automatic authorization to transport, license renewal. An individual who holds a license authorizing the individual to possess restricted firearms or handguns, referred to in subsection or 12.6.1, so short-barreled handguns, must, if the license is renewed, be authorized to transport them within the individual's province of residence to and from all shooting clubs and shooting ranges that are approved under Section 29. And it doesn't apply to a restricted firearm or a handgun if it was approved for being part of a gun collection. So you got to be aware of that too. So first, this doesn't give you this authorization to transport just because you've got a firearms license. They have to issue this automatically when you renew your license. There's a second time when they may have to issue this automatically, and that's when you get a transfer of a prohibited firearm or restricted firearm to yourself. So if you go and buy a new handgun, then they have to issue you this authorization to transport to shooting clubs and shooting ranges in your province. But they don't have to do it just because they revoked the previous one. So there's nothing that actually says they had to issue you a new authorization to transport. So this creates a bit of a problem. They say that they've done this, but they haven't given us sort of an official authorization to transport yet. I was unable to convince them to email me one, so that's a bit of a problem, because I would really like to have the paper saying I've got an authorization to transport in case I get stopped by the same people who are sending me this notice. Yeah, this is actually providing a substantial incentive to gun owners that you might want to go buy a new restricted firearm, because that actually triggers this automatic authorization to transport requirement, which provides some legal protection. So hit up your gun store, buy a new gun, because the Liberal Party of Canada has actually created a substantial legal hurdle that buying a new handgun will prevent. Again, um, yeah, the talking points on this one kind of write themselves. This is once again an example of really bad legislative drafting, because if they were smarter, they would have said that, you know, upon this coming into effect, that that these automatic, you know, provisions would be triggered and they'd have to reissue everything, you know, once again. Or just said, listen, this authorization to transport is always a condition on the license and therefore doesn't need to be issued. But I am not the person designing these laws, so that's where we're stuck. There's a few other really interesting sort of situations that to note. Previously, so the law as it stood noted to and from all shooting clubs and shooting ranges approved under Section 29, again within the individual's province of reference, but also these other things. The province of residence is a key bit here, because there are some people that this really potentially causes some problems for. In particular, if you are a resident of Lloydminster, Alberta, as differentiated from Lloydminster, Saskatchewan, because Lloydminster is a really neat town that actually straddles the border. Lloydminster's got a great shooting club that is just on the Saskatchewan side. So if you live in Alberta, this automatic authorization to transport doesn't cover that range, which is probably the range you're going to. So you'll need to also make sure you talk to the chief firearms officer and make sure that you get it included if that is the range you take your handguns to, because otherwise you are committing very serious criminal offenses that have very serious jail time attached to them, and I don't want to see that. Somebody else asked an interesting question here about what happens if you want to transport it to the shooting club and shooting range, and that the club or range that you are going to also happens to have a gunsmith. So that's kind of interesting because it doesn't actually note that it has to be transported to and from the shooting clubs and shooting ranges for the purpose of target shooting. So that's kind of interesting in that sense. Uh, you have to have that reason in order to initially get the firearm or the authorization itself. But once you're actually transporting them to and from, it doesn't say that you have to actually target shoot there. You can do other things there. That said, it's probably safest, and so I'm not giving anybody advice here to go and do that. I would say it is safest and best practice to make sure you get that separate authorization of transport, because the last thing you want to do is become a test case on this. Being a test case means that you suddenly have a legally interesting problem, and having a legally interesting problem means that you have a practically expensive problem. So something to avoid, I would say, even though there is an argument for it being potentially acceptable. So in substance, the RCMP notice is accurate, assuming that the Canadian Firearms Program actually has issued you a new authorization of transport, but I would say that you can't know that until you actually call and confirm, because this may not be correct. And although you would have one hell of an argument under the officially induced error doctrine, that's a really bad place to be, because officially induced error, and I should maybe do a video on officially induced error and its history and what it's about, but it's kind of a weak argument. It's a last ditch argument because it's an exception to the normal rule that, lack of understanding of the law is not a protection here. However, this might actually be a mistake of fact argument, given that now they're saying that, you have an authorization to transport. Legally interesting problems, which again, expensive. I really don't like how this is happening because, when you're talking about wanting gun owners to follow the law and to follow this, shouldn't it be simple and easy to understand? Shouldn't it be something that is straightforward? Because, we want to know that our lawbreakers are people who have made a choice to be lawbreakers. And, people who have willingly decided to step outside the boundaries of what is allowed. Not people who are just trying their best to get to understand all of this and are confused. Especially given that actually the Firearms Act includes provisions to get a firearms license. Like if you're illiterate, there are provisions for, alternate testing and stuff like that. It's really contemplated that there might be some subsistence hunters, for example, who might need to get a firearms license, notwithstanding the fact that they can't read or write. So the pool of firearms owners is potentially a pretty broad and diverse pool of people. Anyway, I could rant about this for hours, and most people don't really want to hear me rant about this for hours, although I know there's going to be a few people in the comments going, please do. But I'll cut it off here. This notice, it substantially tells you what is going on, assuming that the RCMP, or the Canadian Firearms Program has actually issued you a new authorization of transport. But please, before you move your restricted or prohibited firearms to and from the range to go target shooting, call and confirm. Just get somebody's voice and, document it somewhere that you had this conversation, because I don't want to see somebody where they are like, oh, hey, you don't actually have one, and they're in the soup at that point. It's government, so I can virtually guarantee that somewhere along the lines there will be a bureaucratic screw up where somebody was supposed to get this new authorization to transport just never got it noted on their file. So make sure that person isn't you, because that person Someone out there has a winning lottery ticket for one hell of a problem. Anyway, thank you for watching. Lots of people wanted me to talk about this one. I guess those are my comments, and this whole thing is incredibly frustrating. Anyway, I hope you found this to be useful. Please like this video. Please share it with your friends. Please subscribe to see more content. I've also got a link to my Patreon below. If you want to join, that's how you do it. I want to thank my Patreon supporters at the $50 level: Jonathan Wheeler, Jason Elliott, Canada's National Farms Association, Kyle Martin, Jean-Guy Toussaint, Ivo Nedev, the CCFR, the Canadian Shooting Sports Association. And at the $30 level, Sights and Arms Limited and Marc-Olivier Damour. And at the $20 level, Matt Ward, Mark Whittington, Dale Nesbitt, Cameron Johnson, and Andrew Elsich. Thank you as well to all the $10 supporters who will be in the crawl immediately following, and all of my other supporters. Thank you for watching. I hope this has armed you with knowledge, and I hope that this sort of cavalcade of legislative oopses comes to an end at some point in the near future, because this is a headache, and I really prefer if the people who are brought before the criminal justice system are actual bad guys and not people that we've just managed to trick with bad legislation and bad implementation of bad legislation. Anyway, thank you for watching. See you next time.